My mother tried to trick me into joining my sister for dinner after she tested me around her husband. My sister's new husband hit on me at our family dinner last week. Complimented my body, ignored his wife sitting right beside me, kept finding excuses to touch my arm. They'd only been married 3 months. I left early, feeling sick. Texted my sister immediately. Your husband's behavior made me really uncomfortable tonight. She asked to meet the next day. I expected her to be furious with him, demand he apologize. Instead, she smiled and said, "It was a test. You passed." What? I had him flirt with you on purpose. I needed to know if you could be trusted around him. You messaging me proved you can. My stomach dropped. You tested me? After what happened with my ex, I had to be sure. Here's the context. Her first husband was my friend before they met. I introduced them. They seemed perfect together until after the wedding, when I stayed with them for work convenience. My underwear started disappearing. First occasionally, then weekly. I accused my sister of mixing up laundry. She swore it wasn't her. Then I caught him, her husband, with my underwear, in their bedroom. He admitted he'd never loved my sister. He'd used her to get close to me. The marriage was a lie. Everything was about his obsession with me. I pressed charges, got a restraining order. My sister divorced him immediately. It was traumatic for both of us. But now she was using that trauma against me. You think I encouraged your ex? I asked, incredulous. You must have given him signals. This test proved you won't do it again. I was a victim. Your ex was a predator who used you to stalk me, and you're punishing me? You should have noticed he liked you. Get out. Don't contact me again if you really think I'm to blame for your ex being a creep. Most of my family agreed she was insane, except my mother. She's just protecting herself, Mom said. You should understand. By making me feel like a predator? By having her husband sexually harass me as a test? This month's family dinner was scheduled early. I told my parents I wouldn't come if my sister and her husband were there. Mom promised they wouldn't attend. I should have known better. I walked in to find them at the table, my sister smirking, her husband avoiding eye contact. You lied, I said to my mother. You need to work this out, Mom replied. Family doesn't hold grudges. My sister stood up. You owe me an apology for your overreaction. This whole situation was your fault anyway. My fault? Your ex-husband was stealing my underwear. You must have encouraged him somehow. Normal men don't just develop obsessions. And now you're trying to break up my new marriage by playing victim. Playing victim? You had your husband sexually harass me. It was a test. It was sick. My brother-in-law finally spoke. For what it's worth, I didn't want to do it. She threatened to divorce me if I didn't. My sister slapped him. Shut up. Wait, I said. She threatened you? He nodded. Said if I didn't test you, it meant I had feelings for you. That refusing proved I was attracted to you. That's insane! My mother intervened. Everyone calm down. This is getting out of hand. Out of hand? I turned on her. You ambushed me. You lied to get me here. Because you're being stubborn. Your sister was hurt before. So was I. Her ex stalked me, stole from me, made me feel unsafe in my own family. And instead of support, I get blamed and tested like I'm some kind of homewrecker. My sister laughed bitterly. You always were the pretty one, the fun one. Men always noticed you first. So this is about jealousy? Your ex-husband was a predator and somehow that's my fault because you're insecure? How do I know you won't steal this husband too? I never stole anyone. Your ex was sick. My dad finally spoke up. Enough. This is insane. She had her husband harass you, then blamed you for past trauma you both experienced. We're leaving. As we headed for the door, my sister called out, You know what? Maybe my ex was right about some things. I froze. What did you just say? He kept journals. About you. I have them. Want to know what he wrote? Want to know what he said you did to encourage him? Those are the delusions of a stalker. Are they? Or is there truth in them? Come back and apologize and I'll burn them. Keep playing victim and I'll show everyone what he wrote about you. What you supposedly said. Did. Wanted. My mother gasped. You wouldn't. My sister smiled. Try me. I have photos too, from his phone. Amazing what angles and editing can suggest. My blood went cold. You're blackmailing me with a stalker's fantasies? I'm protecting my marriage. You have 1 week to apologize publicly, or everyone sees what kind of person you really are. I couldn't move. Dad's hand stayed on my shoulder while my sister's words hung in the air like poison. The journals, the photos, the threat to show everyone. My brain kept trying to process it, but nothing made sense. She was my sister. We grew up together, shared a room until high school, told each other everything. Now she stood there smiling like she'd just won something. Mom was still talking behind us, saying we needed to stay and work this out, but her voice sounded far away. I turned toward the door and Dad moved with me, his hand staying on my shoulder like an anchor. My legs felt weird, like they might not hold me up, but I kept walking. One step, then another. Behind us, Mom's voice got louder, calling my name, then Dad's name, begging us to come back. The door felt heavy when I pushed it open. Cold air hit my face and I gulped it down, trying to breathe normally. Dad steered me toward his car in the driveway. I heard the front door open behind us and Mom calling out again, but Dad opened the passenger door and helped me inside before walking around to the driver's side. He started the engine and backed out while Mom stood on the porch watching us leave. The car felt too quiet. I stared at my hands in my lap and they were shaking. Dad drove without saying anything, just turning left out of the neighborhood instead of right toward my apartment. After a few minutes, he pulled into a grocery store parking lot near the back where there weren't many cars. He put the car in the park and turned off the engine. That's when everything hit me all at once. My sister had those journals, the ones the stalker kept about me, the ones where he wrote down his sick fantasies and twisted everything I said or did into proof I wanted him. And photos too, edited to make it look like I was encouraging him somehow. She was going to show people, show our family, our friends, maybe post them online. Everyone would see those lies and think they were true. A sound came out of my throat, something between a sob and a gasp. My chest felt tight and I couldn't get enough air. Dad reached over and put his hand on my arm but didn't say anything. I cried hard, the kind of crying that makes your whole body shake. All the fear and anger and hurt from the past 2 years came pouring out. The stalking, the restraining order, the way my sister blamed me for her ex's obsession, and now this. Using my trauma as a weapon against me. Dad let me cry without trying to make me stop or tell me it would be okay. He just sat there with his hand on my arm while I fell apart. Eventually, the crying slowed down and I could breathe again. I wiped my face with my sleeve and stared out the windshield at the empty parking lot. Dad cleared his throat. He told me this wasn't about me apologizing. His voice was firm and serious. What my sister was doing was a crime, blackmail, extortion. We needed to get legal help immediately, not try to reason with her or give in to her demands. I turned to look at him and his jaw was set in that way it gets when he's really angry but trying to stay calm. He said we were finding me a lawyer tonight and dealing with this the right way. I nodded because I couldn't think of what else to do. My brain felt foggy and slow. Dad pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his contacts. We sat in that parking lot for over an hour. Dad made call after call, leaving voicemails and sending texts. He explained the situation in short, careful sentences. His daughter was blackmailed by her sister using materials from a previous stalking case. We needed someone who specialized in harassment and family law. Most calls went to voicemail since it was evening, but he kept trying. I watched him work through his contact list with this focused determination I'd only seen a few times before. Finally, someone called back. Dad answered and stepped out of the car to talk, pacing in the parking lot while he explained everything again. Through the windshield, I could see his free hand gesturing as he talked. After about 10 minutes, he got back in the car. His colleague had recommended someone named Leah Webster. She was a lawyer who'd handled similar cases involving family members using private information as leverage. Dad had her office number and was calling first thing in the morning to set up an emergency meeting. He looked at me and said he was coming with me to the appointment. This wasn't something I had to face alone. I felt tears starting again, but I pushed them back. I thanked him and he squeezed my shoulder before starting the car. Dad drove me back to my apartment and walked me inside. He checked all the windows and locks like he used to do when I was little and had nightmares. Before he left, he made me promise to call him if anything happened, no matter what time. I promised and he hugged me tight before heading out. The apartment felt too quiet after he left. I tried to sit on the couch but couldn't stay still. My mind kept replaying my sister's face when she made the threat, that cold smile, the way she said I had 1 week. I paced around the living room trying to remember her exact words. What had she said she would show people? The journals where the stalker wrote about things I supposedly did to encourage him. Photos with angles and editing that suggested things that never happened. My phone buzzed on the coffee table and I grabbed it. A text from Mom. It said I was being unreasonable and my sister was just protecting herself. I needed to come back and apologize before this got out of hand. Another text came through, Mom saying my sister had been through so much with her ex, and I should understand why she needed reassurance. A third text, begging me to think about the family and stop being so stubborn. I stared at the messages and felt sick. Mom was taking her side, again. More texts kept coming. Mom saying I was overreacting, that my sister loved me and would never actually follow through on the threat, that I needed to be the bigger person and just apologize to keep the peace. Each message felt like a knife. My own mother was telling me to give in to blackmail, to let my sister get away with threatening me with a stalker's twisted fantasies. I turned my phone off and threw it on the couch. The silence felt better than seeing those messages. I tried to go to bed but just lay there staring at the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those journals. The stalker had filled pages and pages with observations about me. What I wore, how I smiled, the way I walked. He'd written entire conversations we'd supposedly had where I flirted with him or gave him signs. None of it was real, but he'd believed it completely. And now my sister had those journals and was going to use them against me. Sleep didn't come. I got up and made tea but couldn't drink it. Paced the apartment some more, checked the locks again. Finally, around 3 in the morning, I crashed on the couch from exhaustion. My phone alarm woke me at 7:30. I'd forgotten I'd turned the phone off and the alarm didn't go through. Dad was knocking on my door instead, calling my name. I stumbled over and let him in. He had coffee and breakfast sandwiches from the place down the street. I tried to eat but could only manage a few bites. Dad ate his sandwich while I got dressed, changing into clean jeans and a sweater that felt safe and comfortable. At 8, we headed to his car. The drive to Leah Webster's office took 20 minutes through morning traffic. Neither of us talked much. I stared out the window watching people go about their normal days, going to work, getting coffee, living lives where their sisters weren't blackmailing them. The lawyer's office was in a professional building downtown. We took the elevator to the 3rd floor and found her suite at the end of the hall. The waiting room was small but nice with comfortable chairs and art on the walls. The receptionist told us Leah would be ready in just a minute. I sat down and my legs started bouncing nervously. Dad sat next to me and put his hand over my knee to stop the bouncing. A woman came out from the back offices. She looked to be in her 40s with short dark hair and sharp eyes behind glasses. She introduced herself as Leah Webster and shook both our hands with a firm grip. Her office had a big desk covered in neat stacks of files and a wall of law books. She gestured for us to sit in the chairs across from her desk. Leah sat down and pulled out a legal pad and pen. She looked at me directly and said to start from the beginning and tell her everything. Her voice was calm but serious, like she'd heard bad stories before and nothing would shock her. I took a breath and started talking. I told her about my sister's first husband, how I'd introduced them, how he'd seemed normal until he wasn't, the underwear disappearing from my room when I stayed with them, catching him with my things, his confession that he'd married my sister to get close to me, the restraining order and my sister's divorce. Leah took notes the whole time, writing quickly without interrupting. Then I told her about the new husband and the test at dinner, how my sister had him hit on me to see if I could be trusted, the fight at my parents' house last night, my sister's threat about the journals and photos, the 1-week deadline to apologize publicly or she'd show everyone. Leah kept writing for a minute after I finished talking, then set down her pen and looked up. She explained that what my sister was doing was criminal blackmail, using threats to try to force someone to do something they didn't want to do. The fact that she was threatening to distribute materials from a stalking case made it even more serious. That could be considered harassment as well. She asked if I had any recordings or witnesses to the threats. I told her about Dad being there and hearing everything, about my brother-in-law admitting my sister had forced him to harass me by threatening divorce. Leah nodded and made more notes. She said we needed to document everything right away. Every text message, every conversation, every detail I could remember. She also said we should consider filing for a restraining order before the week deadline ran out. That would legally prevent my sister from contacting me or following through on her threats. I asked what would happen if we did that. Leah said it depended on how my sister responded, but at minimum it would create a legal record of her behavior and give us protection. If she violated the order, she could be arrested. We spent the next 2 hours going through everything. Leah had me write down a timeline starting with when my sister's first husband began stalking me and ending with last night's threat. She asked detailed questions about dates, locations, who else was present. Dad gave his account of what he'd witnessed at the dinner. Leah recorded both our statements on her phone with our permission. While she was typing up notes, she mentioned something that made my stomach drop. She said my sister having those journals might actually be illegal. They were evidence in a criminal case that resulted in a restraining order. Those materials should have been sealed or destroyed as part of the court order. If my sister had them, she either stole them or the ex-husband violated the order by giving them to her. Either way, it opened up new legal problems for my sister. Leah said she needed to make some calls to find out what happened to those materials after my case concluded. She asked if I remembered the name of the detective who handled the stalking investigation. I gave her Detective Baird's name and she wrote it down, Leah picked up her office phone and called the police department. She got transferred a few times before reaching someone in records. She explained she was calling about a closed stalking case and needed to verify the status of evidence. After some back and forth, she got the information she needed. She thanked them and hung up, then immediately dialed another number. This time she asked for Detective Baird directly. When he answered, she introduced herself and explained she was representing me in a blackmail case involving materials from the old stalking investigation. She briefly outlined what my sister was threatening to do. There was a long pause while she listened. Her expression got more serious. She told Detective Baird we could meet that afternoon if he was available. She wrote down a time and thanked him before hanging up. Leah looked at me and Dad. The journals and photos were supposed to be sealed as part of the restraining order agreement. They should have remained in police custody or been destroyed. The fact that my sister had them meant something had gone very wrong. Either the ex-husband kept illegal copies, or someone had accessed sealed evidence. Both were serious violations. Detective Baird wanted to meet with us at 2 that afternoon to discuss how my sister obtained the materials and what charges might apply. Dad suggested we get lunch before the meeting with the detective. We left Leah's office and drove to a diner nearby. The lunch crowd was thinning out, but the place was still busy. We got a booth in the back and a waitress brought menus and water. I stared at the menu but couldn't focus on the words. Dad ordered a burger for himself and a sandwich for me without asking what I wanted. When the waitress left, he leaned back against the booth and rubbed his face with both hands. He looked tired. He started talking, saying he was sorry. Sorry he hadn't seen how bad my sister's jealousy had gotten. Sorry Mom had been enabling her behavior for so long. Sorry he hadn't stood up to them sooner. I told him it wasn't his fault. He shook his head and said he should have done something after the stalking case when the victim blaming started. When my sister first suggested I must have encouraged her ex somehow. When Mom agreed and made excuses, he should have shut that down immediately, but he'd tried to keep the peace instead. Now look where we were. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. I told him he was here now and that's what mattered. He squeezed back but still looked upset with himself. The food came, but neither of us ate much. I picked at my sandwich and Dad's burger sat mostly untouched on his plate. We both drank a lot of coffee, though. At 1:30, we paid and headed to the police station. Detective Baird met us in the lobby and led us back to a small conference room. He looked older than I remembered from 2 years ago, more gray in his hair. He shook hands with Dad and nodded at me before sitting down across the table. Leah arrived a few minutes later and joined us. Detective Baird opened a file folder and spread out some papers. His face looked dark and angry as Leah explained again what my sister was threatening. She laid out the timeline and the specific threats about showing people the journals and edited photos. Detective Baird listened without interrupting, his jaw getting tighter. When Leah finished, he pulled up something on his laptop and turned it so we could see. It was the case file from my stalking report. He scrolled down to the evidence log and pointed at entries for journals and digital files. He said everything on that list was supposed to stay in police custody per the restraining order. The judge had specifically ordered all materials to remain sealed to protect my privacy. The fact that my sister now had copies meant someone had seriously violated that order. Either my ex-brother-in-law had kept illegal copies before surrendering the originals, or someone had accessed the sealed evidence improperly. Both scenarios were criminal violations that carried their own penalties. I walked Detective Baird through everything my sister said at that dinner table. The exact words about the journals, the threat about showing edited photos to everyone, how she gave me 1 week to apologize publicly, or she'd destroy my reputation with a stalker's twisted fantasies. Detective Baird typed notes into his computer while I talked, stopping me occasionally to ask for specific details. He wanted to know if anyone else heard the threats besides Dad. I told him my mother was there, my brother-in-law too, but Mom would probably deny it happened the way I said. Detective Baird nodded like he expected that answer. He asked if I'd be willing to wear a wire and meet with my sister again to get her threats on recording. My stomach twisted at the thought of facing her again. Leah jumped in before I could respond, and said that wasn't a good idea given the emotional toll and family dynamics involved. She suggested we send a formal cease and desist letter instead, demanding my sister turn over all materials and stop the harassment. Detective Baird considered this and agreed it was a safer approach. He said the letter would create a paper trail, and if my sister responded poorly, it would strengthen our case. Leah pulled out her laptop right there in the conference room and started drafting the letter, while Detective Baird and Dad discussed the legal implications of my sister possessing sealed evidence from a criminal case. Leah's fingers flew across her keyboard as she wrote the cease and desist letter. She read sections out loud as she typed, using legal language that made the threats sound even more serious than they already were. The letter named specific blackmail statutes my sister was violating. It demanded she surrender all journals, photos, and any other materials within 48 hours. Failure to comply would result in criminal complaints and a restraining order petition. Leah asked Dad if he was willing to testify against my sister if this went to court. Dad didn't hesitate. He said he'd tell a judge exactly what he witnessed at that dinner and how my mother had lied to get me there. Leah typed that into the letter as a warning that my sister had no family protection from consequences. She printed 3 copies when she finished. One for our records, one for Detective Baird's file, and one to send via certified mail to my sister. Dad read through the letter carefully before we sent it. His face got darker as he read the legal language spelling out what my sister had done. He signed his name at the bottom as a witness to the threats. Leah sealed the letter in an envelope and wrote my sister's address in neat handwriting. We drove to the post office together and sent it certified mail with tracking confirmation. The clerk gave us a receipt with a tracking number. Leah took a photo of it with her phone. Back in Leah's office, she told me I should stay with family or friends until we saw how my sister responded to the letter. She said people facing legal consequences sometimes escalated their behavior out of panic or spite. Dad immediately offered his house, but I shook my head. That would create more conflict with Mom, who was already taking my sister's side. I pulled out my phone and called Patience instead. She answered on the second ring, and I explained the situation as quickly as I could. Patience didn't ask questions or hesitate. She just said I could stay as long as needed and asked when I wanted to come over. I told her I'd pack a bag and be there in an hour. Dad drove me to my apartment and waited in the car while I went inside. I threw clothes into a duffel bag without really looking at what I grabbed. Toiletries from the bathroom, my laptop and charger. I moved through my apartment like I was running from something, which I guess I was. My own sister, my own family. I locked the door behind me and got back in Dad's car. He drove me to Patience's apartment across town. She met us at the door and pulled me into a tight hug before I could say anything. Dad carried my bag inside and set it in the guest room. Patience made tea while Dad and I sat at her kitchen table not saying much. He left after finishing his tea, making me promise to call if I needed anything. Patience showed me where everything was in the guest room. Clean towels in the closet, extra blankets if I got cold. She told me to make myself at home and not worry about anything. I unpacked my bag and tried to feel grateful for having a friend like her, but mostly I just felt sick about hiding from my own family. The next 48 hours crawled by like torture. I checked my phone constantly for the delivery confirmation, refreshing the tracking page every few minutes. Patience tried to distract me with movies, but I couldn't focus on what was happening on screen. We cooked dinner together the first night, and I burned the vegetables because I was staring at my phone instead of the stove. My mother started calling around noon the second day. I let it go to voicemail. She called again an hour later. Then again. By evening, she'd left 6 voicemails. I finally listened to them while Patience was in the shower. The first one was angry, demanding I call her back immediately. The second was pleading, saying we needed to talk about this situation before it got worse. The third threatened to cut me off completely if I didn't drop the legal action against my sister. The fourth accused me of tearing the family apart. The fifth said I was being selfish and cruel. The sixth was back to angry, telling me I'd regret choosing lawyers over family. I deleted all of them and blocked her number. Patience came out of the bathroom and found me sitting on her couch with tears running down my face. She sat next to me and didn't ask what was wrong, just put her arm around my shoulders and let me cry. On the second day, the tracking page finally updated, delivered and signed for at 2:15 in the afternoon. My hands shook as I showed Patience the confirmation. She squeezed my shoulder and told me to breathe. Within an hour, my phone started buzzing with texts from my sister. The first few were furious, calling me dramatic and saying I was overreacting to a joke. She insisted she never actually planned to show anyone the materials. She was just trying to make a point about trust. The texts kept coming, one after another. Leah had told me to forward everything directly to her, so I screenshot each message and sent them. My sister's tone shifted in the later messages. She wrote that the legal threat was unnecessary and I was being vindictive, that she'd only been trying to protect her marriage, that I should understand given what happened with her ex. I forwarded those too, and Leah responded within minutes saying these messages were actually helpful because my sister was admitting to possessing the materials. That admission alone proved our case. I put my phone face down on the coffee table and tried to stop my hands from shaking. The messages kept coming throughout the evening. My sister's tone changed from defensive to aggressive. She called me ungrateful for everything she'd done for me over the years. She accused me of trying to destroy her marriage with lies about her husband being coerced. She wrote that her husband was completely on her side, and I was making up the part about him being threatened. She dared me to try to prove any of this in court. She said no judge would believe my version of events. The messages got meaner as the night went on, calling me names and bringing up old arguments from years ago. Leah texted me to stop reading them and just forward everything without looking. I tried, but it was hard not to see at least part of each message as I screenshot it. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold my phone. Patience took it from me and said she'd handle the forwarding. She sat next to me on the couch and screenshot each new message as it came in, sending them to Leah without letting me see the content. I was grateful and humiliated at the same time. That evening, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. My brother-in-law's voice came through quiet and rushed like he didn't have much time. He said he was calling from a friend's phone because my sister had been checking his cell. He told me he was willing to give a statement about being threatened into harassing me, that he'd been documenting my sister's controlling behavior for weeks now. Text messages where she told him what to wear, who he could talk to, where he was allowed to go without her. He said he wanted to help me, but he was scared of what she'd do if she found out. His voice cracked when he asked if there was a way to protect him legally. I told him to hold on and called Leah on Patience's phone, then conferenced her into the call. Leah explained that my brother-in-law could provide testimony and potentially file his own restraining order if he felt unsafe. There was a long pause before he responded. He admitted my sister had threatened to ruin him financially and socially if he ever tried to leave her, that she'd told him she'd make sure everyone believed he was abusive and unstable, that she'd take everything in the divorce and make sure his family never spoke to him again. He'd been sleeping in the guest room since the dinner incident because being near her made him anxious. Leah's voice was gentle as she gave him her direct number and told him to call if he decided he wanted legal protection. She said what my sister was doing to him was abuse and he didn't have to live that way. The call ended with him thanking us both, his voice shaking with what sounded like relief and fear mixed together. After we hung up, I sat staring at Patience's wall, wondering how my sister had become this person. The next morning came and the 48-hour deadline passed with no word from my sister about surrendering the materials. Leah called at 9 to tell me she was filing a formal police complaint for blackmail and harassment. I listened to her explain the process while drinking coffee that tasted like metal in my mouth. Detective Baird would open an investigation. They'd request a warrant to search my sister's home for the journals and any evidence of the manipulated photos. The legal process was moving forward exactly like Leah said it would, but I felt sick knowing this was really happening with my own family. That I was the one who set this in motion by refusing to apologize for something I didn't do. Leah must have heard something in my silence because she reminded me that my sister made these choices, not me. That I was protecting myself from illegal threats. I said I understood, but my voice came out flat and empty. 2 hours later, someone started pounding on Patience's apartment door. Heavy, aggressive knocking that made us both jump. My mother's voice came through the door demanding I come out and fix this mess I'd created. She kept pounding and yelling, saying I was destroying the family over nothing, that my sister was just protecting herself and I was being vindictive. Patience grabbed her phone and called the police while I stood frozen in her living room. My mother's voice got louder, threatening to break down the door if I didn't come out. She screamed that I was an ungrateful daughter who'd turned everyone against my sister with lies, that she'd raised me better than this. The pounding continued until we heard sirens outside. 2 officers arrived and I heard them talking to my mother through the door. She refused to leave at first, insisting she had a right to see her daughter. The officers told her she was trespassing and needed to leave the property immediately. My mother's voice rose higher as she argued with them. Eventually, they escorted her away, and one officer knocked gently on the door. Patience answered, and the officer asked if we were okay. He took notes about the incident and said it would be included in their report. After he left, Leah called to say the incident report would support our case about family harassment patterns. I sat on Patience's couch feeling like my entire life had turned into a legal case file. Dad's call came through around 9 that evening while I was still sitting on Patience's couch staring at my phone. His voice sounded tired in a way I'd never heard before, like something inside him had finally broken. He told me he packed a bag and left the house an hour ago. He couldn't stay there anymore, not while Mom was actively working against my safety and enabling my sister's criminal behavior. The words came out flat and final, like he'd been practicing them. He said he was staying with his brother Colt across town, and he'd told Mom he wouldn't come back until she stopped choosing my sister over doing what was right. I felt my chest tighten as he explained this, the weight of it settling over me like concrete. My legal action was breaking up my parents' marriage. Dad must have heard something in my silence because he jumped in quickly, insisting this had been building for years and wasn't my fault. He said Mom had always prioritized my sister's feelings over everyone else's well-being, and he was done pretending that was normal or acceptable. I told him I was sorry anyway, my voice cracking. He said there was nothing to be sorry for and that he loved me. After we hung up, I sat there feeling like my entire family was disintegrating around me, pieces falling away one by one until I didn't know what would be left. 3 days crawled by with no word about the search warrant. I stayed at Patience's apartment and tried to keep myself busy with work emails and cleaning tasks that didn't need doing. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, expecting news. Finally, on Thursday afternoon, Leah called to say the warrant had been executed that morning. Detective Baird's team showed up at my sister's house at 7 with paperwork and went straight to her home office. They found 2 journals in a locked desk drawer, spiral-bound notebooks filled with my ex-brother-in-law's handwriting. They also found a folder of printed photos tucked behind some files in a cabinet. My sister was home during the search, and according to the report, she became hysterical immediately. She screamed that the materials were hers and the police had no right to take them. She tried to physically block the officers from removing the journals, claiming they were her property, and she'd done nothing wrong by having them. The officers had to physically move her aside to complete the seizure. They took everything and informed her on the spot that she'd be charged with possession of stolen evidence and blackmail. Leah's voice was calm and professional as she relayed all this, but I could hear an edge of satisfaction underneath. She said the evidence was now secure and my sister couldn't use it to threaten me anymore. I thanked her and hung up, then immediately ran to Patience's bathroom and threw up. The relief mixed with horror made my whole body shake. Leah called again later that same day to explain the charges in detail. 2 misdemeanors, she said. Possession of stolen evidence from a sealed criminal case and attempted blackmail. The possession charge carried potential fines and probation. The blackmail charge could mean jail time, depending on my sister's criminal history and how the judge viewed the case. I sat on Patience's couch with the phone pressed to my ear, trying to process that my own sister was facing criminal charges because of me. Leah must have sensed my spiral because her voice got firmer. She reminded me that my sister chose these actions, not me. My sister obtained materials she shouldn't have had, materials that were supposed to be sealed or destroyed. She threatened to release them publicly to force me into a false apology. Those were crimes and they had consequences. I was simply protecting myself from illegal threats, which was my right. The words made sense logically, but emotionally I felt sick. This was my sister. We'd grown up together, shared a room for years, knew each other's secrets. Now she was being criminally charged and I was the one who set that process in motion. Leah asked if I was okay, and I lied and said yes. After we hung up, I sat staring at Patience's wall, wondering how we'd gotten here. The next morning, I woke up to notifications blowing up my phone. My sister had posted something on social media overnight and people were responding. I opened the app with shaking hands and found a long post about being persecuted by a vindictive family member who was lying to police to cover up their own bad behavior. She didn't name me directly, but anyone who knew our family would know exactly who she meant. She wrote about how she was just trying to protect her marriage, and her sister was making false accusations because of jealousy and spite. She claimed the police search was harassment and she'd done nothing wrong. The post had dozens of comments already, family members asking what was going on, friends offering support, a few people suggesting she get a lawyer. I screenshot the whole thing with trembling fingers and sent it to Patience, who was in the kitchen making coffee. She came into the living room and read it over my shoulder, then immediately grabbed her phone and started taking her own screenshots. She sent everything to Leah with a message explaining what my sister had posted. Leah responded within minutes saying this could be considered witness tampering or intimidation, especially the part about false accusations. She said to document everything but not to respond or engage at all. I followed her advice, but it felt awful watching my sister spin this narrative where I was the villain and she was the victim. Detective Baird called me directly 2 days later with an update about the evidence analysis. His voice was serious, but I could hear satisfaction underneath as he explained what his team had found. The photos my sister had were definitely digitally manipulated. The timestamps and metadata proved they'd been edited recently, within the last few months. Someone had taken old photos and altered them to suggest things that never happened, changing angles and context to create false implications. The technical team could see every edit that had been made. The journals were confirmed to be from my ex-brother-in-law's stalking case, the same ones that were supposed to be in police custody or destroyed per the restraining order agreement. Detective Baird said they were working to determine how my sister obtained sealed evidence, whether my ex violated the order by giving them to her, or if there was some other breach. This discovery strengthened the case significantly and could add charges related to tampering with evidence. He asked if I was doing okay with everything, and I told him I was managing. After the call ended, I sat there feeling vindicated and horrified at the same time. My sister had fake photos. She'd planned to destroy my reputation with edited images and a stalker's fantasies. The manipulation was even worse than I'd thought. My mother's voicemail came through that afternoon while I was trying to eat lunch. I saw her name on my screen and let it go to voicemail, my appetite disappearing instantly. When I finally listened to the message an hour later, her voice was cold and furious. She said I'd destroyed the family and she'd never forgive me for having my sister arrested over a misunderstanding. She claimed my sister was just trying to protect her marriage, and I was being vindictive because I was jealous of her happiness. The words kept coming, each one like a slap. She said I'd always been dramatic and attention-seeking, that I'd blown this whole thing out of proportion, that a real sister would have just apologized and moved on. She demanded I drop the charges and fix this mess before it was too late. The message ended with her voice breaking as she said she didn't know who I'd become. I played it for Leah during our next call and she listened in silence. When it finished, she asked how I was feeling and I told her honestly that I felt like my mother lived in a different reality. Leah said the message showed a clear pattern of harassment and suggested I consider a restraining order against my mother as well. The idea made my stomach hurt, but I told her I'd think about it. I made an appointment with Raven Montgomery for the following Tuesday because I was barely sleeping and having panic attacks about the family situation. Patients had recommended her, saying she specialized in family trauma and victim advocacy. Raven's office was in a quiet building downtown with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. She was in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm presence that made me feel safer immediately. I spent the first session just telling her everything. The whole story from my ex-brother-in-law's stalking through my sister's blackmail threat and the current criminal charges. Raven listened without interrupting and took notes occasionally. When I finished, she looked at me and said something that made my chest tight. She said my sister's behavior was abusive, and my mother's enabling was its own form of abuse. She validated that protecting myself legally was healthy boundary setting, not family destruction. She explained that toxic family members often flip the script and make victims feel responsible for the consequences of calling out abuse. She said I was doing exactly what I should be doing by refusing to apologize for something I didn't do, and by seeking legal protection from threats. We talked about the grief I was feeling over losing these relationships, and she helped me understand that I didn't lose them. I protected myself from their abuse. The distinction felt important somehow. By the end of the session, I felt lighter than I had in weeks, like someone finally understood what I was going through. My brother-in-law called again a week after giving his initial statement. His voice sounded different this time, stronger and more determined. He told me he'd decided to file for separation from my sister, and he wanted to give a full statement to police about being coerced into harassing me. He said he'd been documenting everything since the dinner incident, saving text messages and keeping notes about her threats and controlling behavior. He had messages where she explicitly threatened to divorce him and ruin his reputation if he didn't test me. He had recordings of arguments where she accused him of being attracted to me just because he'd refused to participate in her plan. He wanted to help strengthen the case against her, and he also wanted to protect himself legally. I conferenced Leah into the call and we arranged for him to meet with Detective Baird the next day. The meeting happened at the police station and lasted over 2 hours. My brother-in-law provided detailed testimony about my sister's threats, her controlling behavior, the coercion around the harassment test. He showed them text messages that proved she'd threatened him with divorce and social destruction if he didn't comply. He explained how she'd been sleeping in separate rooms since the dinner and how she monitored his phone and computer constantly. Detective Baird's report said the testimony was credible and detailed, providing significant corroboration for the criminal case. Leah called me afterward to say his cooperation had strengthened our position considerably. The upgraded charges came through 2 weeks later. Leah called to tell me the district attorney had reviewed my brother-in-law's testimony and decided to add coercion and criminal harassment to the existing blackmail and evidence tampering charges. She explained this was serious, that my sister was now facing potential jail time rather than just probation. The DA's office was taking the case seriously because the evidence was so strong and because my sister's behavior showed a pattern of manipulation and threats. Leah said my sister's lawyer had already contacted her asking about a plea deal, trying to negotiate before the charges were formally filed. I asked what that meant, and Leah said we should wait and see what they offered. She reminded me that I had input in any plea agreement since I was the victim, and that we didn't have to accept anything that didn't adequately protect me and hold my sister accountable. I thanked her and hung up, then sat there processing the fact that my sister might actually go to jail. The thought made me feel sick and relieved at the same time. Dad called a few days later to tell me he'd met with a divorce attorney. His voice was quiet and sad as he explained that he'd spent the last few weeks thinking about his marriage, and he'd realized it had been broken for a long time. He said Mom had always prioritized my sister's feelings over everyone else's well-being, making excuses for her behavior, and expecting everyone to accommodate her issues. He'd gone along with it for years, thinking he was keeping the peace, but now he saw how toxic that pattern had been. The blackmail situation and Mom's response to it had forced him to confront what he'd been avoiding. He told me he wasn't making any final decisions yet, but he needed space to think about whether he could stay with someone who enabled their daughter being blackmailed. I told him I supported whatever he decided and I was sorry this was happening. He said it wasn't my fault and that he should have stood up to Mom years ago. We talked for a while longer about practical things, about where he was staying and how he was doing. Before we hung up, he told me he loved me and he was proud of how I'd handled everything. I cried after the call ended, grieving the family I'd thought I had. Leah called 3 days later with news about the plea deal. My sister's lawyer had reached out proposing she plead guilty to misdemeanor harassment in exchange for dropping the blackmail and evidence tampering charges. The deal included probation and mandatory counseling, but no jail time. Leah explained the terms carefully, her voice neutral and professional as she walked me through what it would mean. I sat on Patience's couch listening to the details, my stomach twisting as I tried to process what my sister accepting this deal would actually accomplish. Leah asked what I thought about the proposal, and I told her the truth. I wanted my sister to face real consequences for what she'd done, for the blackmail and the threats and the way she'd weaponized my trauma. But I was also exhausted by the whole situation, drained from months of legal proceedings and family conflict, and constantly looking over my shoulder. The idea of a trial where I'd have to testify and face my sister in court made me feel sick. Leah listened without interrupting and then suggested we counter with additional terms. We could tell the DA's office we'd consider the plea if it included a 5-year restraining order and restitution for my legal fees and therapy costs. That way, my sister would face accountability and I'd get protection and compensation for the damage she'd caused. I agreed immediately because both things felt necessary: the distance and the acknowledgement that her actions had real costs I'd been forced to pay. The DA's office took 2 days to respond to our counter-proposal. Leah called again, and this time her voice had an edge of satisfaction. The prosecutor wanted my sister to plead to the blackmail charge as well since the evidence was so strong, not just the harassment. They'd recommend probation instead of jail time if she accepted full responsibility for both crimes. My sister's lawyer had pushed back hard, arguing that pleading to blackmail would create a more serious criminal record and make it harder for her to find work. But the prosecutor held firm, and eventually my sister caved. She agreed to plead guilty to both blackmail and harassment with 3 years probation, mandatory counseling twice a month, a 5-year restraining order and restitution of $8,000 covering my legal fees and therapy costs. Leah walked me through the terms again, making sure I understood what each piece meant. The probation meant my sister would have regular check-ins with an officer, and any violations could send her to jail. The counseling was court-ordered, so she'd have to actually attend and participate. The restraining order meant she couldn't contact me or come within 500 feet of my home or workplace. And the restitution meant she'd have to pay me back in monthly installments over the next 2 years. Leah advised me to accept the deal because it gave me legal protection and held my sister accountable without putting me through the trauma of a trial. I said yes, relief and sadness mixing together, as I realized this was really ending with my sister having a criminal record. We scheduled the court date for 2 weeks later so my sister could formally enter her guilty plea and the judge could approve the terms. Leah prepared a victim impact statement for me to read if I chose to, explaining that it would be my chance to tell the court how my sister's actions had affected me. She sent me a template with sections about psychological harm, damage to family relationships, and ongoing safety concerns. I opened the document and stared at the blank spaces where I was supposed to fill in my experience. The words wouldn't come at first because how do you summarize months of fear and betrayal in a few paragraphs? I spent days writing and rewriting the statement with Raven's help during our therapy sessions. We worked through draft after draft, trying to express the betrayal without breaking down completely. Raven helped me focus on specific impacts rather than general feelings. How my sister's blackmail made me feel unsafe in my own family. How she weaponized my trauma from being stalked by her ex-husband. How her actions forced me to choose between my safety and family relationships. How I still had nightmares about those journals being released, and everyone believing the stalker's lies about me. Each sentence felt like pulling glass from a wound, but Raven kept reminding me that speaking the truth was part of my healing. By the time the court date arrived, I had a statement I could read without completely falling apart, though my hands shook every time I practiced it. The morning of the court hearing, I woke up before my alarm with my heart already racing. Patience made me breakfast, but I could barely eat, my stomach too tight with nerves about seeing my sister and my mother in the courtroom. Dad picked me up at 9 and we drove to the courthouse in silence, both of us processing what was about to happen. Patience met us in the parking lot and walked in with us, her presence steady and calming as we went through security and found the right courtroom. The hallway outside was empty except for a few other people waiting for their cases. We sat on a bench near the door and I tried to breathe normally while Dad checked his phone and Patience squeezed my hand. At 9:30, the bailiff opened the doors and we filed inside. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and institutional. My sister was already there with her lawyer at one of the tables up front. She wore a navy dress and had her hair pulled back, looking professional and composed in a way that made my chest tight. My mother sat in the front row directly behind my sister, her face set in hard lines as she watched us enter. Mom's eyes found mine across the courtroom, and the look she gave me made my stomach hurt, like I was the criminal instead of the victim. We took seats on the opposite side with Dad between Patience and me, creating a physical barrier between our family's two factions. The judge entered and everyone stood. Then the hearing began with the prosecutor reading the charges. My sister's lawyer confirmed she was pleading guilty to blackmail and harassment. The judge asked my sister directly if she understood the charges, and she said yes in a flat voice that carried no emotion. He asked if she was pleading guilty voluntarily, and she said yes again without looking at me or anyone else. The whole exchange took less than 5 minutes, my sister admitting to crimes against me in the most mechanical way possible. The judge asked if I wanted to read my victim impact statement, and my legs went shaky as I stood up. I walked to the microphone at the front of the courtroom with my printed statement clutched in both hands. The paper rattled slightly as I unfolded it, and I had to take a breath before I could start reading. My voice came out quieter than I'd planned as I read about how my sister's blackmail made me feel unsafe in my own family, how she'd taken my trauma from being stalked and used it as a weapon against me. I read about the nightmares and the anxiety attacks, and the way her threats made me question whether I could trust anyone. I read about how her actions forced me to choose between protecting myself and maintaining family relationships, how she'd made me feel like I had to prove I wasn't responsible for a predator's obsession. My voice broke several times and I had to pause to steady myself. I didn't look at my sister while I read, but I could feel her presence at the table, could sense my mother's anger radiating from the front row. When I finished and returned to my seat, Dad squeezed my hand hard and whispered that I'd done well. Patience had tears on her face and handed me a tissue. My mother sat rigid and unmoving, her head shaking slightly in disgust at what I'd just said about her daughter. The judge accepted the plea deal and moved directly to sentencing. He gave my sister 3 years probation with mandatory counseling twice monthly, 100 hours of community service, and the 5-year restraining order. His voice was stern as he lectured my sister about the seriousness of blackmail and how family relationships don't excuse criminal behavior. He explained that blackmail destroys trust and weaponizes people's vulnerabilities, and that using a stalker's materials to threaten someone was particularly cruel. He warned her that any violation of the restraining order would result in immediate jail time, that he wouldn't tolerate her contacting me or coming near me for any reason. My sister nodded throughout the lecture, but her face stayed stone cold, showing no remorse or emotion. The judge asked if she had anything to say, and she declined. He finalized the sentence and dismissed us. As we gathered our things to leave, my sister turned slightly, and our eyes met for just a second. Her mouth moved, and I heard her hiss quietly that I'd regret this, the words barely audible but clear enough that I knew what she'd said. Dad heard it too, and his hand tightened on my shoulder as we walked toward the exit. Outside the courthouse, my mother intercepted us before we could reach the parking lot. She moved fast for someone her age, blocking our path with her face twisted in rage. She started screaming that we'd destroyed her daughter's life over nothing, that I was a manipulative liar who'd turned everyone against my sister. Her voice carried across the courthouse steps, and people stopped to stare at the scene. Dad tried to move around her, but she grabbed his arm and kept yelling. She called me a vindictive attention seeker who couldn't stand that my sister was happy. She said I'd always been jealous of my sister, and this was just my latest attempt to ruin her life. Dad's voice stayed calm as he told her that our daughter had committed crimes and faced consequences, that if she couldn't see that, then they had nothing more to discuss. Mom's face went red and she screamed that he'd chosen sides against his own child. Dad said he'd chosen to protect the child who'd been victimized, not enable the one who'd committed blackmail. That's when Mom slapped him. Her hand cracked across his face hard enough that his head turned with the impact. The sound echoed off the courthouse walls and everyone nearby froze. Courthouse security responded immediately, 2 officers jogging over to intervene. They separated Mom from Dad and asked what was happening. Dad touched his reddening cheek and said his wife had just assaulted him. The officers asked if he wanted to press charges, and Dad hesitated before saying no. He just wanted her away from us. Security escorted Mom off the courthouse property, while she continued screaming about how we'd all betrayed her. I stood there shaking, unable to process that my mother had just hit my father in public because he'd supported me. Dad drove me back to Patience's apartment in silence, both of us too stunned to talk about what had just happened. When we pulled up, he turned to me with his cheek still red from the slap. He said he needed to tell me something, and I braced myself for more bad news. He told me he was filing for divorce from Mom because her behavior at the courthouse was the final straw. His voice was quiet, but firm as he explained that he couldn't be married to someone who thought it was acceptable to physically assault him for protecting their child from blackmail. He said he was done making excuses for her enabling behavior, done pretending their marriage was salvageable when she'd chosen to defend criminal actions over supporting her victimized daughter. I started crying because even though I knew it wasn't my fault, I felt like my family was completely falling apart. Dad pulled me into a hug and said this had been building for years, that Mom's pattern of prioritizing my sister's feelings over everyone else's well-being had damaged their marriage long before the blackmail incident. He said he should have stood up to her years ago, but he'd kept hoping she'd change. Now he finally understood she wouldn't, not when she was willing to hit him for doing the right thing. We sat in the car for a while longer while I cried and Dad held my hand. He promised we'd get through this together, that he wasn't abandoning me no matter what happened with the rest of the family. When I finally went inside, Patience took one look at my face and made tea while I told her everything that had happened at the courthouse. The next few weeks brought a flood of family contact as word spread about the court case and the courthouse incident. Relatives I hadn't heard from in months started reaching out asking what had happened between me and my sister. Some had heard Mom's version where I was a liar destroying my sister's life. Others had heard bits and pieces from various family members. I spent hours on the phone explaining the situation to aunts and uncles and cousins, walking them through the harassment test and the blackmail threats and the criminal charges. Several were horrified by what my sister had done and angry at my mother for defending it. My aunt called to say she couldn't believe Mom had enabled such terrible behavior, that blackmail was never acceptable regardless of family relationships. My uncle on Dad's side reached out to offer support and said he'd talk to other relatives about making sure I knew I wasn't alone. But a few took my mother and sister's side and cut off contact with me completely. 2 cousins sent messages saying they couldn't believe I'd had my own sister arrested over a family disagreement. An aunt I'd been close to growing up blocked my number after I explained the situation. The family was splitting into factions, and I was losing people I'd thought would support me. Uncle Colt became one of my strongest supporters, calling regularly to check on me and telling other family members they needed to understand the facts before judging. He hosted Dad at his house and made it clear to everyone that he believed me and thought my sister's actions were criminal regardless of family ties. My brother-in-law's separation from my sister became final during this time, and he moved out of their house into his own apartment across town. The process had taken months of legal back and forth, but he was finally free. He sent me a message through social media apologizing for his role in the harassment and thanking me for giving him the courage to leave an abusive marriage. His message was long and detailed, explaining how watching my sister face consequences helped him realize he didn't have to live in fear of her threats. He wrote that seeing me stand up to her and involve the police had shown him that her behavior wasn't normal or acceptable, that he'd been trapped in her manipulation for so long, he'd started to think it was just how relationships worked. He said he was starting therapy to work through his own trauma from the relationship, and that his therapist was helping him understand how my sister had used coercion and emotional abuse to control him. He thanked me again for reporting what happened because it had saved him from years more of misery. I wrote back telling him I was glad he got out and that I hoped therapy helped him heal. The exchange felt like a small piece of justice, knowing that at least one person had escaped my sister's control because I'd refused to stay silent about her behavior. I kept going to therapy every week with Raven, and things got a little easier each time. The panic attacks happened less often, and I could sleep through most nights without waking up thinking about my sister or my mother. Some days I felt almost normal, and then something small would trigger me and I'd spend an hour crying in my car before I could drive home. Raven told me that was okay and normal and part of healing from family trauma. She kept saying I didn't lose my mother and sister. I protected myself from people who were hurting me. That distinction mattered because I'd been carrying around this heavy guilt, like I was the one who broke the family apart. Raven helped me see that healthy families don't blackmail each other or make their kids choose between safety and loyalty. She said the family was already broken if those were the options I was given. That helped me process the grief without drowning in it. I still had bad days where I missed my mother so much it physically hurt, but I could remind myself that the mother I missed wasn't the one who ambushed me at dinner or defended my sister's blackmail. I was mourning the mother I thought I had, not the one who actually showed up when I needed protection. 3 months after the court case, I realized I'd built a whole new life that felt stable and safe. Dad and I had dinner every Tuesday night at this Italian place near his brother's house. Uncle Colt invited me to family barbecues, and his wife treated me like I'd always been part of their regular gatherings. My cousins from his side of the family started texting me random memes and asking if I wanted to join their group chat. It felt good to be included without drama or tension. Patience came over most weekends, and we'd cook together or watch movies, and she never made me talk about the family stuff unless I brought it up first. One night, she told me she was proud of how I'd handled everything, and that took me by surprise because I mostly felt like I was barely keeping it together. She said that was exactly what strength looked like, doing the hard thing even when you're scared and tired. I started believing her a little bit. My phone buzzed one afternoon with a message request from an account I didn't recognize. The profile picture was some generic sunset photo, and the name was just random letters and numbers. I almost deleted it without looking, but something made me open it. The message said I was a liar who destroyed families and that everyone would see the truth eventually. My stomach dropped because I knew exactly who was behind that fake account. More messages came through over the next hour, each one angrier than the last. My sister called me manipulative and said I'd turned Dad against her and ruined her life for attention. She said the restraining order was just me playing victim again, and that she was the real victim of my lies. I took screenshots of every single message with my hands shaking. Then I called Detective Baird and sent him everything. He sounded tired when he answered, but his voice got sharp when I explained what was happening. He said violating a restraining order was a serious offense and he'd handle it immediately. 2 hours later, he called back to say my sister had been arrested and would spend at least the night in jail. I felt sick and relieved at the same time. The next day, Detective Baird told me my sister had been released after 2 days, but the judge had given her a serious warning that the next violation would mean a much longer sentence. He said the judge had been very clear that restraining orders exist for a reason, and my sister needed to understand there were real consequences for breaking them. After that, my sister's social media went completely quiet about me. I checked a few times even though I knew I shouldn't, and there were no more posts or comments about family drama or being victimized. Dad heard through Uncle Colt that my sister was going to her court-ordered counseling sessions, but nobody knew if she was actually participating or just showing up to check the box. I decided I didn't need to know. Whether my sister was changing or not wasn't my responsibility anymore. I had to focus on my own healing and let her deal with her own consequences. Raven helped me understand that I could hope my sister got better without needing to be part of that process. It was okay to protect myself and wish her well from a distance. That mindset helped me stop obsessing over what my sister was doing or thinking. I couldn't control her choices, and trying to figure out if she was really changing just kept me stuck in the past. Dad's divorce from Mom got finalized on a cold morning in November. He called me from the courthouse parking lot and his voice sounded different, lighter somehow. He said he felt like he could breathe properly for the first time in years. He'd signed the papers and walked out, and instead of feeling sad, he felt free. He told me he wished he'd had the courage to leave sooner, but he was grateful the situation with my sister had finally forced him to prioritize his own well-being over keeping peace. He moved into a condo near Uncle Colt the following week, and I helped him unpack boxes and set up furniture. The place was small but bright with big windows, and it felt like a fresh start. We ordered pizza and sat on his new couch, and he told me about his plans to take up woodworking and maybe travel a bit. He seemed younger somehow, less weighed down. I realized I'd never seen him truly relaxed before. We grew closer during this time because we were both rebuilding our lives and figuring out what family meant without my mother and sister in it. He was the parent who showed up and believed me and chose my safety over family loyalty. That meant everything. Patience introduced me to someone at a party she threw for her birthday. He was funny and kind, and when the family topic came up naturally in conversation, I told him the basic truth about the restraining order and the court case. I expected him to get weird about it or ask too many questions, but he just nodded and said, that sounded really hard, and he was sorry I'd gone through it. Later, when we started actually dating, he told me his own family had some toxic dynamics, and he understood about needing boundaries. He never pressured me to reconcile with my mother or sister, and he never acted like I was damaged goods because of the drama. When I had bad therapy days, he'd bring me takeout and let me talk or not talk depending on what I needed. It felt healing to be with someone who respected my choices and didn't try to fix me or push me toward forgiveness I wasn't ready for. He met Dad and Uncle Colt's family and fit in easily, and I started to believe I could have healthy relationships with people who actually cared about my well-being. 6 months after the court case, I heard through family that my sister had finished her community service hours. She'd apparently spent weekends picking up trash in parks and helping at a food bank. The probation was ongoing and would last another 2.5 years, but she hadn't violated it again after the restraining order incident. Someone told me she was seeing a different therapist now, one who specialized in personality disorders, and that she'd supposedly started taking some responsibility for what she'd done. I had no way to verify that, and no direct contact with her to know if it was true. Part of me was glad she might be getting real help, but I kept my boundaries firm. I wasn't ready to reconcile and might never be ready. That was okay. I could hope she was healing without needing to be part of her life. Mom sent a letter through my aunt asking if we could meet to talk. I opened it carefully and read through it twice. The letter talked about how hard it was to be a mother caught between 2 daughters, and how she'd tried to protect both of us. She said she understood I was hurt, but she hoped I could see things from her perspective eventually. She wanted to meet for coffee and talk through everything. There was no apology anywhere in the letter. No acknowledgement that she'd enabled my sister's blackmail or that she'd lied to get me to that ambush dinner. Just explanations and justifications and requests for understanding. I brought the letter to my therapy session, and Raven helped me see that my mother still wasn't taking responsibility for her role in what happened. She was asking me to understand her without offering to understand me first. I wrote a short response saying I was open to contact when she was ready to acknowledge how her enabling had hurt me and how she'd chosen my sister's feelings over my safety. I said I needed a real apology that showed understanding of what she'd done wrong, not just an explanation of why she did it. Until then, I wasn't ready to meet. Dad supported my decision completely. Uncle Colt called to invite me to a family barbecue at his house. He said he was inviting Dad and several cousins and aunts and uncles who'd been supportive, and he wanted to create a family gathering that felt safe for everyone. My mother and sister weren't invited. I felt weird about that at first, like we were purposely excluding them, but Uncle Colt said firmly that they'd excluded themselves by their actions, and this was about celebrating the family members who showed up for each other. The barbecue was on a sunny Saturday, and I walked into Uncle Colt's backyard to find about 15 relatives there. People hugged me and asked how I was doing, and nobody brought up the drama unless I mentioned it first. We ate burgers and played cornhole, and it felt almost normal. There was a moment when I looked around at everyone laughing and talking, and I felt both sad and grateful at the same time. Sad that my mother and sister weren't there, but grateful to be surrounded by people who believed me and respected my boundaries. I realized I could have family connection without putting myself in danger. This was what healthy family looked like. The restitution payment from my sister arrived in my bank account on a Tuesday morning. It was set up as a payment plan through the court, so I'd get monthly deposits until the full $8,000 was paid off. The first payment was for $600. I stared at my phone screen for a long time looking at the transaction. The money helped with my ongoing therapy costs and the legal fees I was still paying off, but that wasn't really what mattered. What mattered was the acknowledgement that my sister's actions had caused real harm that required making amends. The court had said her behavior had consequences, and this was part of those consequences. I transferred the money into a savings account I'd started specifically for emergency legal protection. If I ever needed a lawyer again, or had to go back to court for any reason, I'd have funds set aside. It felt good to be practical about protecting myself going forward. I started dating someone I met through Patience about 8 months after the court case ended. We took things slow because I was still working through everything in therapy, but having someone who understood boundaries and respected my healing process made all the difference. My partner was patient when I had bad days and never pushed me to talk about my family situation before I was ready. After we'd been together for about 4 months, I felt ready to introduce them to Dad and Uncle Colt's family at one of the regular barbecues. Dad shook my partner's hand and welcomed them warmly, asking genuine questions about their work and interests without making it awkward. Uncle Colt's wife pulled out extra chairs and made sure my partner felt included in all the conversations. My cousins treated my partner like they'd known them for years, joking around and sharing funny stories. At one point during the evening, my partner leaned over and whispered that my chosen family seemed more functional than most biological families they'd encountered. That comment stuck with me because it highlighted how far I'd come in building a support system based on respect rather than obligation. These people showed up for me consistently, believed me when I needed support, and never made me feel like I had to earn their care. Having my partner see that healthy dynamic and want to be part of it felt really good. Over the next few weeks, my partner integrated naturally into family gatherings and became friends with several of my relatives. Dad invited us both to dinner regularly, and Uncle Colt started including my partner in text chains about upcoming events. The ease of it all reminded me that relationships should feel safe and supportive, not constantly stressful or conditional. I heard through my cousin Rachel that my sister had started a new job at a marketing firm about an hour away from where she used to work. Rachel mentioned it casually during a phone call, saying she'd run into an old mutual friend who knew my sister professionally. Apparently, my sister was doing well in the new position and focusing on rebuilding her career after everything that happened with the probation and court case. Rachel said the friend mentioned my sister seemed more stable and was attending therapy regularly as part of her probation requirements. I felt a mix of emotions hearing this update. Part of me was genuinely glad my sister was moving forward and getting help, even though we had no contact and I had no plans to reach out. Another part of me felt cautious about believing she'd really changed, given everything she'd put me through. Rachel also mentioned that my former brother-in-law, my sister's ex-husband, had apparently moved to a different city and was dating someone new. She'd heard through the family network that he was doing well in therapy and working on understanding the patterns that led him to stay in such a controlling relationship. I was relieved to hear he'd gotten out and was building a healthier life. It seemed like everyone involved in the chaos was finding their own path forward, even if those paths never intersected anymore. The distance felt necessary and right, like we all needed space to heal separately before any of us could function in the same orbit again. A year after my sister's blackmail threat at that awful family dinner, I sat in Raven's office and realized how completely different my life had become. I'd built routines that felt safe and authentic, surrounded myself with people who respected my boundaries, and learned to recognize toxic patterns before they could hurt me. The nightmares about my sister releasing those manipulated photos had mostly stopped, and I could go days without thinking about the whole situation. Raven asked how I was managing my relationships with family members, and I told her about the clear boundaries I'd maintained with my mother and sister, while deepening connections with Dad, Uncle Colt's family, and supportive relatives. I explained how I'd created new friendships through work and hobbies, people who knew me without the baggage of family drama. My support network felt solid in a way it never had before, built on mutual respect rather than blood obligation. Raven nodded and suggested we consider moving to less frequent therapy sessions since I'd developed strong coping skills and didn't seem to need weekly support anymore. The idea made me nervous at first because therapy had been my anchor through the worst parts of the crisis, but I also recognized that I'd grown enough to handle most situations without needing professional guidance every week. We agreed to try bi-weekly sessions and see how I managed with the extra space. Walking out of her office that day, I felt proud of the work I'd done to heal and protect myself. The person I'd become over the past year was stronger and more self-aware than I'd ever been before. My mother's letter arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon, forwarded through my cousin Rachel, who'd been asked to pass it along. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it, my hands shaking slightly as I tore the seal. The letter was 3 pages long, written in my mother's careful handwriting. She started by saying she'd been thinking about me constantly and wanted to reach out to see if we could meet for coffee and talk. She said she understood I was hurt by what happened at the courthouse when she showed up supporting my sister, and she acknowledged that slapping Dad in public was wrong. Then the letter shifted into explanations and justifications. She wrote about how difficult it was being caught between 2 daughters, how she'd tried to protect both of us in her own way, and how my sister's actions were motivated by past hurt from her first marriage. She said she hoped I could see things from her perspective eventually, and understand why she'd made the choices she did. There was no real apology anywhere in the 3 pages, no acknowledgement that she'd enabled my sister's blackmail, or arranged that ambush dinner knowing I'd specifically said I wouldn't come if my sister was there. Just requests for understanding and explanations of her thought process. I brought the letter to my therapy session with Raven, and we went through it together line by line. Raven helped me see that my mother was still asking me to understand her, without offering to understand me first. She was seeking reconciliation on her terms, wanting me to accept her version of events, rather than taking responsibility for how her enabling had damaged our relationship. I spent the next few days drafting a response, writing and rewriting until I had something that felt honest without being cruel. I told my mother I was open to contact when she was ready to acknowledge how her behavior had hurt me and how she'd chosen my sister's feelings over my safety. I said I needed a real apology that showed understanding of what she'd done wrong, not just an explanation of why she did it. Until then, I wasn't ready to meet. I sent the letter and felt a sense of peace about maintaining that boundary. Dad called after I told him about my response, and he said he fully supported my decision. He mentioned that my mother was slowly starting to understand the damage she'd caused, but she still had a long way to go before she'd be ready to take real accountability. The wedding invitation arrived 4 months later for my cousin Gina's marriage. I knew immediately that both my mother and sister would be there since Gina was close with that side of the family. The restraining order had been modified to allow brief contact at family events as long as my sister didn't approach me directly or attempt conversation, so legally I could attend without violating any court orders. I called Dad to talk through whether I should go, and he said he'd be there to support me if I decided to attend. Uncle Colt also reached out and promised his whole family would stick close to me throughout the event. I decided to go because I genuinely cared about Gina and didn't want my sister's presence to stop me from celebrating important family moments. The wedding was at a beautiful outdoor venue with about 100 guests. I arrived with Dad and immediately spotted my mother sitting near the front on the bride's side. She saw me walk in, and her expression shifted through several emotions, surprise and sadness, and something that might have been regret. But she didn't approach or wave, just watched me find a seat on the opposite side of the aisle. My sister arrived a few minutes later with some relatives I didn't recognize, and she stayed on the far side of the venue exactly as the restraining order required. I could see her glancing in my direction occasionally, but she never tried to come closer or make contact. The ceremony was lovely, and I focused on Gina and her partner exchanging vows, trying not to think about the family tension hovering in the background. At the reception, Uncle Colt and his family formed a protective circle around me at our table, making sure I felt safe and included in conversations. Several cousins came by to hug me and tell me they were glad I'd come. My mother stayed at her table on the other side of the room, and I caught her watching me a few times with an expression I couldn't quite read. My sister left early before the dancing started, and I felt my shoulders relax once she was gone. The rest of the evening, I actually enjoyed myself, dancing with Dad and my cousins and celebrating Gina's happiness. Driving home that night, I felt proud that I'd attended and maintained my boundaries at the same time. The day after the wedding, my phone started buzzing with calls from various relatives. Uncle Colt was the first to reach out, saying he'd had a long conversation with my mother at the reception after I'd left. He told me he'd been direct with her about how her enabling behavior had damaged multiple relationships, and that she needed to take responsibility if she wanted to repair things with me. He said my mother had listened and seemed to actually hear what he was saying, though whether she'd act on it remained to be seen. My Aunt Karen called next and said she'd also spoken with my mother, encouraging her to get therapy to address the patterns that led her to prioritize my sister's feelings over everyone else's well-being. Karen mentioned that several other family members had similar conversations with my mother throughout the evening, all of them expressing concern about how she'd handled the situation with my sister's blackmail. I was touched by their advocacy, the way they'd taken it upon themselves to speak up on my behalf without me asking them to. It felt good knowing I had people willing to have difficult conversations to support me, but I also wasn't holding my breath for major changes from my mother. Years of enabling behavior didn't shift overnight, just because relatives had a few frank talks with her. I appreciated their efforts while maintaining realistic expectations about whether my mother would actually do the work to change. I heard through family channels that my sister completed her probation successfully about 18 months after the court case. The criminal case officially closed with her record showing the guilty pleas for blackmail and harassment, though the restraining order remained in effect for several more years as part of the original court order. My cousin Rachel mentioned that my sister had apparently expressed some remorse to a few family members about how she'd handled everything, acknowledging that the blackmail was wrong and that she'd let her jealousy drive her to hurt me. But my sister hadn't attempted to contact me directly, which I appreciated. The restraining order prevented direct contact anyway, but I was glad she seemed to understand that respecting the distance was important. I felt content with how things had settled. We were living completely separate lives with no overlap, and that felt healthier than forcing some kind of reconciliation neither of us was ready for. Some relationships just couldn't be repaired, and that was okay. I'd built a life without my sister in it, surrounded by people who supported and believed me, and I had no desire to disrupt that stability by trying to rebuild something that had been broken in such a fundamental way. Dad called me one evening about 6 months after the wedding to tell me he'd started dating someone new. Her name was Claire, and he'd met her through a photography group he'd joined after the divorce. He sounded almost shy telling me about her, like he wasn't sure how I'd react to him moving on from my mother. I told him I was happy for him and wanted to meet her when he felt ready for that step. He said Claire knew about the family situation and had been supportive and understanding about everything he'd been through. A few weeks later, Dad brought Claire to one of Uncle Colt's barbecues, and I got to meet her properly. She was warm and friendly without trying too hard, asking genuine questions about my work and interests without prying into the family drama. I could see why Dad liked her. She seemed stable and kind, the opposite of the chaos he'd dealt with during his marriage to my mother. Over the next few months, Dad and Claire became more serious, and he seemed genuinely happy for the first time in years. He told me during one of our weekly dinners that leaving his marriage with my mother had been the hardest thing he'd ever done, but also the most necessary. He said he'd spent too many years making excuses for her enabling behavior and sacrificing his own peace to keep the family together, and he was grateful to be building a healthier life now. I was happy seeing him thrive and glad that something positive had come from the painful family split. The promotion I'd been working toward for months finally came through on a Friday afternoon. My manager called me into her office and told me I'd been selected for the senior position I'd applied for, with a significant raise and new responsibilities starting the following month. I called Dad immediately after the meeting, and he congratulated me with genuine pride in his voice. That weekend, my partner organized a celebration dinner with Dad, Claire, Uncle Colt's family, and patients at a nice restaurant downtown. Everyone toasted to my success, and the table was full of laughter and supportive comments about how hard I'd worked. The achievement felt especially meaningful because I'd accomplished it while dealing with intense family trauma over the past 2 years. There'd been days when I could barely focus at work because I was so stressed about the court case or my mother's harassment, but I'd pushed through and kept performing well. My support system had helped me stay grounded during the worst parts, and now I was celebrating a major career milestone with the people who'd stood by me. Uncle Colt raised his glass and said he was proud of my strength through everything I'd faced, and several others echoed the sentiment. Driving home that night with my partner, I felt grateful for how far I'd come and excited about the future I was building. 2 years after my sister's blackmail threat at that family dinner, I sat on my apartment balcony one evening and reflected on how completely my life had transformed. I had healthy boundaries with toxic family members, deep relationships with supportive ones, and a partner who respected my needs and celebrated my growth. My career was thriving, My friendships were solid, and I'd learned to recognize manipulation and protect myself before it could cause harm. The family situation had settled into a stable distance where my mother and sister existed in a separate orbit that didn't intersect with mine. Some relatives had chosen sides and stopped speaking to me, but the ones who mattered had stayed and proven their support through consistent actions. I'd accepted that some relationships might never be repaired, and I was okay with that because my well-being mattered more than maintaining toxic connections, just because we shared blood. Raven had told me during one of our final regular sessions that I'd done remarkable work in healing and protecting myself, and I believed her. The person I'd become through this process was stronger, more self-aware, and better equipped to handle future challenges than I'd ever been before. Building a life based on respect and healthy boundaries wasn't something I'd imagined possible during the worst of the family crisis. I sat down at my desk one evening and pulled out nice stationery, the kind that felt appropriate for something important. I wrote carefully, keeping my words simple and honest. I thanked my sister for respecting my boundaries over the past year and told her I'd noticed her growth through what family members had shared. I explained I wasn't ready for a direct relationship yet, but I was open to occasional updates through Dad or Uncle Colt if she wanted to share how she was doing. Writing the letter felt good because I wasn't angry anymore, just clear about what I needed. I signed it, sealed the envelope, and mailed it the next day. When I told Raven about the letter during our session that week, she smiled and said this was exactly the kind of balanced approach she'd hoped I'd reach. She pointed out that I'd maintained my boundaries while still leaving room for potential healing in the future, which showed real growth. I'd learned to protect myself without closing off completely, to stay open to possibilities without sacrificing my safety. Raven said we could start spacing out our sessions to once a month since I'd developed such strong skills for handling difficult situations. My partner and I spent a Saturday afternoon at the dining table with wedding planning materials spread everywhere, making lists and looking at venue photos. Dad stopped by with takeout and joined us, offering opinions on flowers and making jokes about the seating chart. Uncle Colt's family was coming for dinner later, and we'd invited patients too, turning the planning session into a celebration with everyone I cared about. Looking around at the people gathered in my home, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for how far I'd come since that awful family dinner 4 years ago. Protecting myself from my sister's blackmail had been the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it led me here to this life built on respect and healthy boundaries. I'd lost my mother and sister, at least for now, but I'd gained clarity about what I deserved and the courage to demand it. My career was thriving, my relationship was strong, and I was surrounded by people who genuinely loved and supported me without conditions or tests. That evening, as everyone laughed over dinner and toasted to the wedding, I realized my life was full of exactly what I'd always wanted: joy and safety and real connection with people who valued me. I was excited about the future I was creating, not because everything was perfect, but because I'd learned to protect what mattered and build something authentic. The wedding planning continued late into the night with Dad and Uncle Colt arguing playfully about music choices, while Patience helped me sketch table arrangements, and I felt completely at peace with the family I'd chosen and the life I'd fought to build.